going to get started. Welcome everyone to the Career Catalyst webinar series, a collaborative effort between AASD East and SCC PDS. Today's session is sponsored by the AASD Associate Member Council. The topic for today's webinar is making the transition from junior investigator to independent surgeon scientist. Our goal today is to provide insights into the unique challenges faced by surgeons transitioning from junior investigators to independent surgeon scientists. We have three outstanding expert speakers who will share their personal experiences, challenges, and strategies for overcoming barriers to establish a successful career that balances clinical duties with academic and research goals. Moderators for the session include Dr. Alex Schwed and Dr. Sarada Rao.
Hi, Alex Schwed. I'm the former vice chair of webinars for the AAST Associate Membership. I'm passing the reins to my colleagues, and I'm really excited to be here and excited to hear what our panelists have to say.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarada Rao. I'm currently assistant professor at UCSF Fresno. I'm very excited to be able to have this great discussion with my peers, colleagues, and our wonderful panelists.
And I'm Molavi, a trauma and critical care surgeon in Chicago, Illinois. Without further ado, our agenda for this evening includes an introduction of our speakers by my co-moderators. Dr. Anaar Siletz will discuss navigating early career challenges. Dr. Todd Constantini will address achieving research independence, and Dr. Rosemary Kozar will share her reflections and future directions.
So now I'll be introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Anaar Siletz, MD, PhD. She is an assistant professor of clinical surgery at Keck School of Medicine at USC. Dr. Siletz is also a recipient of the AAST Research and Education Scholarship for her work on whole transcriptome dynamics in neutrophils after blunt trauma. Next, we have Dr. Todd Constantini, who is professor of surgery at University of Minnesota School of Medicine. He is division chief of critical care and acute care surgery and a member of the scientific advisory council for the Coalition for National Trauma Research. And finally, we are honored to have Dr. Rosemary Kozar, MD, PhD. She's professor of surgery and director of translational research at the R. Adams Cali Shock Trauma Center at the University of Maryland. She also serves as acting director at National Study Center, co-director of STAR ORC, and the chair of scientific advisory committee for the Coalition of for National Trauma Research.
So we're going to start with Dr. Siletz and explore navigating early career challenges.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's a real honor to be here today with some of the giants in the field. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about navigating early career challenges, and I don't have any disclosures except that I'm still very much figuring this out myself. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Constantini and Dr. Kozar speak as well. The panelists very helpfully put together some questions to some talking points to sort of get me started. One of which was, what did you look for in finding an academic surgical job, and what would you recommend that other people look for? And I think, the answer to this, you're going to notice a kind of a theme to my talk. But the main thing that I would look for when you're getting ready to look for an academic surgical job, or really any job, is really a strong mentor, somebody who is really going to look out for you and who is going to tell you things the way they truly are, and can advocate for you and make connections for you in the sort of network that you as a trainee may or may not even really fully understand exists. So I think mentorship is the most important thing when you're starting to look for a job, in getting you the right job for you, someone who's going to look at you honestly and give you honest feedback and go to bat for you. And similarly, I think that's one of the most important things as a junior person when you're finding your first academic surgical job, is identifying good mentors. And ideally, if you are looking for a research career, that of course is going to include research mentors, people who are interested in something similar to you and have been very accomplished at that and can teach you. That is very important. But I think also when you're very junior and you're getting your first academic surgical job, it's also very important that as you sort of find your feet as a clinical surgeon, that you also have clinical mentorship, that you have people that you can turn to when things are difficult clinically. I would say that the weight that takes off of you in having people that you trust that you can go to when you have a tough problem is incredibly important for actually being able to make use of what time you have to do research. So if you are, as you're trying to balance these things, you really need to have people who are going to help you in both these arenas, both research and clinical. And then the next question, very important question that they suggested was to talk about what are you going to do if you don't have enough protected time to really get your projects going? And I understand anecdotally from my conversations with many other junior faculty in honestly many other professions in or many other specialties in surgery, that this is pretty much a universal fact of life, that you will never have enough protected time to really be able to do all of the things that you want to do. Protected time, I think, really varies not only based on the contract, but also on what that ends up translating to. And so it's, again, very important to have mentors and to have people that you trust who are experienced, who will be able to explain to you what your protected time is really going to look like. Ideally, people who are already at the institution that you're looking at as you're looking for a job, or people who can give you general advice on, are you expected to be generating a certain amount of RVUs? For most of us in trauma, we don't have to build a practice, so that's a huge stressor off of us. But I think very important to talk to someone experienced that you trust about the protected time that is in contracts that you're looking at. Because none of us will ever have as much protected time as we could certainly use, I do find it's extremely important to find ways to use the time that I do have. So I have 2 kids. Probably many of the people on the call are balancing significant and hopefully wonderful, work-life balance situations. But it's really important to be able to protect both of those times. And one of the ways that I've found that can be very helpful is to make a list of all the millions and millions of things that I need to do and I haven't done yet. And then if I have 15 minutes, then I can probably knock a few of those off. If it's something that I really need to be sitting down and thinking for a long period of time, then I have to block that off. Or sometimes I'll find that I can actually break that into chunks so that you never really stop thinking about it throughout the course of your day and you can get it done in little chunks as you're dealing with other things. But I think you have to be fairly disciplined with the time that you have when you're trying to get done more than seems like you have time for. Similarly, just being organized. If you have a research meeting, you need to meet with somebody every once in a while to talk about what you're doing, your research residents or whoever you're working with. I think it's really, really important to schedule that in because otherwise the time will get eaten up by other things. That was one of the most useful tips of many, many useful tips that my fabulous mentors have given me is just make sure that you schedule that time. Similarly, if you need to crunch numbers, make sure that you're scheduling that time and just put it on your calendar as a meeting that you can't get out of. And then hopefully things will get done. And similarly, when we talk about protected time, especially as you're starting out as a junior person, and you are also, again, trying to get your clinical feet, I think it's important to look at others in your department who will be doing more clinical work for the additional protected time that you will have and ask yourself, how am I benefiting them by doing this? In some departments and divisions, that may be more obvious than in others, but also there may be opportunities to collaborate with your clinical partners in ways that would benefit both of you. And that I think in general, I think the more collaborative you can be on both the clinical and the research side, the easier it is to make use of protected time and to not feel like you're constantly having to protect it, but rather that other people are protecting it for you, which is very nice. And then finally, the last talking point was what societal resources I have used to sort of get started. I got very, very lucky thanks to one of my mentors who encouraged me to apply for the AAST Research Scholarship, which I got. And that was incredibly helpful because of the money that it provides, which is wonderful because then you suddenly are able to delegate, you're able to pay for things, you're able to pay for supplies. But also I was not prepared for how much having a grant that has a name and has some prestige attached to it, how much that opens doors for you, where you can say, you know, people don't really care necessarily, it turns out, how much it's for. The value of the grant is much, much more than the actual monetary amount, because if you're a junior person who can say, you know, I have this, I was awarded this, then people start to take you a lot more seriously. And I found that a lot of collaborations were very much enhanced. A lot of university resources were suddenly open to me. Things that I didn't know were sort of closed before, all of a sudden they opened up and really allowed me to get a tremendous amount of help, which then led to more funding. So I highly encourage everyone to apply for AAST scholarships if that is appropriate to your work. But then I also encourage you, in whatever success that you have, to make the most of it and to recognize and have your mentors point out to you the opportunities that may be open for you now that you have that you, even if you've only applied for it and it's been reviewed and it got a good score, then by all means use that. Societal resources would not be complete if I didn't say it again. Mentorship, the amazing mentorship that is available through our professional societies. There is someone who knows how to do absolutely everything. And I've certainly made a lot of use of that. And, you know, just the general networking and collaboration. Again, somebody knows how to do everything, and working together, we can just get so much more done. So that is all that I have. Thank you so much again. It's been a real honor.
Thank you so much for your perspective and insight, Dr. Siletz. So before we move on with our the rest of our panel, I just want to say if anyone has any questions for Dr. Siletz or any individual panelists throughout the session, please hold on to your questions. We do have a dedicated Q&A session after all of our speakers have presented. And with that, we will now move on. Next, we're going to have Dr. Constantini talk about mid-career perspective and achieving research independence.
All right. Well, thank you all. And thanks for the invitation to be part of this group, and really happy to be here and just tell a little bit, and mostly the things that maybe I wish I did different, or the roadblocks that I found along the way, and hopefully give sort of some perspective on those, and kind of a path through the middle part. So my part of this, I think, is you know, I have my own lab, and maybe I have a little bit of funding, but now what do I do? And so I'm going to talk through that a little bit. I don't have any disclosures. You know, I think that the charge I was given was to talk a little bit about sort of the transition in the mid-career, but also how I kind of got where I am without PhD training. And I sort of never really thought much about that. I never saw not having a PhD as an impediment to things. And I have no special talents, I don't think. I think it's just a lot of what I'll try to talk about here is you know, finding the mentorship and collaboration, and finding the right people to get on your team, I think, is really what makes the biggest effect on your career, and which is what makes this fun. So just a little bit about myself. I did my residency at UC San Diego and was fortunate to work for 2 years in the lab of Dr. Raul Coimbra, where I basically went from very little research experience at all to a pretty immersive and intensive experience, and something that I really enjoyed, and worked with a great team in addition to Dr. Coimbra during that time, and really learned a lot, learned how to do this, I think, and found the interest in doing this as part of my career. And so when I finished my fellowship, I took a job at UC San Diego, and, you know, sort of got my own lab. But the truth is, I sort of went back to the lab that I spent time in during my research, and had a pretty strong mentorship during that time. And my studies are really related to, the SIRS response to injury, and I look at how monocytes and macrophages drive acute lung injury, and how the human inflammatory response is different than other species and genes that sort of mediate that. I also do clinical research, so I have an opportunist and maybe have a short attention span. So I like all of us, find other interesting questions to ask, and spend some time thinking about VT prophylaxis and pelvic fracture, and have been funded for some various different things. So this is sort of my funding journey, and I want to kind of pick up on Dr. Siletz's comments, which is the society fellowships are really critical early on in your faculty time. I was lucky to have the AAST fellowship as well, and was really transformational to my career. And for me, the money was certainly helpful, but it was really the credibility that it provided me both within my department and nationally, and really, to Dr. Siletz's point, opened a lot of doors for me moving forward. And so I think it's really important to think about that. And I was planning for that, applying for that grant even during my fellowship and before I started my faculty job. And so I sort of built up to that point and was able to hit the ground running. But for me, that led to the American College of Surgeons research fellowship for 2 years, and then the American Surgical Association research for 2 years. And within that, was able to sprinkle in some money. So, none of these funds were enough to run my lab independently. Of course, I still needed institutional support to help, buy supplies. But this really kind of kept the street cred going for me as I went. And I think the other thing I want to say is, along this path, I have the disclaimer of I'm not showing you the unsuccessful, but this is a understatement of the number of grants I sent in that were harshly rejected. And so that's just part of the game. And part of this is just not getting discouraged and keeping your head down and moving forward. So I just want to make sure I'm very clear that this wasn't some easy process where I just sort of flew through and it all turned out perfect in the end. So what are the keys for research success? So I think the biggest things, these are pretty obvious, but time, money, your team, and then ultimately, having some grit and putting in some hard work. I think the time, Dr. Siletz, I think, had really good points about time management and blocking time out. And I can tell you, it really gets more challenging as you get a little bit more senior, because I remember when I started, I had my clinical work, obviously, and then I had research, and I didn't have too much else going on. But before you know it, you've got hospitals, committee responsibilities. Maybe you have a leadership role in your division. You've got maybe committee responsibilities in multiple different surgical societies. You may have an elective practice that you've built. You've got all these competing interests on your time. So sort of scheduling that and being very conscious of blocking time out to protect your research is really important. In my instance, it was like elective surgery cases would kill my research time, right? I put a case on here and there, and then the case gets delayed or the case goes long, and now all of a sudden your day's shot. And so I pretty quickly learned to kind of get that under control. Funding is obviously important, and it's getting, I think, ever more challenging. I think the discretionary money within most divisions and departments is less than it used to be, where they could help support you or make the gap in some of the funding that you needed to get going. I think, even the NIH grant dollars don't go as far as they used to, as far as helping you buy, research techs and bring people into your lab and to help you do the work. The next two we'll talk about kind of more as we go through. So again, this is just sort of the time management issue. Is you just got to get organized, but be flexible and realize that if you don't make time, it'll get sucked up with other things. So I think the biggest advice I'd give is build your team and build a good team, and that team's going to look very different. I was lucky to have worked with and continue to work with a PhD researcher in the lab who really I can credit with a lot of the successes I've had research-wise, because he was sort of there when I wasn't, and could provide sort of the mentorship and the help me with the ideas and think some things through. But if you look at this team down here in the middle of the screen, there's my research partner, Dr. Elisari, but I've got a dermatologist who's a scientist, a head and neck researcher, a sepsis biologist, and then some of our techs, TBI researchers. So they're not just surgeons, they're not just studying inflammatory cells. There's people who are bringing a diverse expertise, and that sort of cross-pollination I found really helped what I do, because you could pick up on methods and techniques and things that you couldn't do maybe on your own. The other part of this is, probably one of the funnest things I think about being, a surgeon scientist, is the ability to work with trainees. So that's either surgical residents, a couple here in the middle of the screen, Elliot Williams and Simone Langness, who are in my lab. We've had a collaboration in our lab with surgeons from Tokyo who come to spend time. And it's sort of, getting to work with these folks and, teach them some research skills, see them, excel in presentations. But really, it's important to, they help out a lot as well with being able to be in the lab, smart people who are thinking about things, providing you with ideas that you hadn't thought of. And so I think it's been a rewarding, but sort of definitely a two-way relationship where they've provided me, ideas and help that is really, I think, really sort of amplified the work that we've done. And I'll talk about scientific collaborators, which I think is ever more becoming important. Science and technology are moving way too fast. So, you can't go to the NIH with your basic science proposal that's going to have some Western blots and an ELISA anymore, right? It's probably not going to work. And so, things come up all the time. Obviously, we're familiar with single cell RNA sequencing. This is single cell velo, which looks at how things change over time, which is something I've never really dealt with, but looks confusing. I have a project where I was interested in looking at some in vivo modeling in something that was very relevant to humans and maybe a little different than just basic cellular. And so I got interested in lung organoids. I didn't know anything about lung organoids or where to even start. And so finding those collaborators either within your university or within your community are really important, because they're going to raise the level of your science. And if you're lucky enough to find either content or technical experts in these areas, you can basically learn from them, have you teach the tips and tricks, help you sort of design some of the experiments, help you analyze the data. All of these things are going to raise your game. And I think if you're not looking around you to find people with complementary expertise, I think that's definitely a missed opportunity, because there continues to be a lot to learn. I think, frankly, it's pretty hard, I think, as a clinician as well, to really be in the weeds all the time on all these different techniques. So I think it's really helpful to find people who you can partner with on these sorts of things. All right, so in general, I think really important to apply for funding often, write as many grants as you can, read other successful grants. And if you get a chance to be on a review or a study section for either society things or the NIH, that is probably where I learned the most about grant writing. You see good grants, you see bad grants, you see how other people, evaluated grants that you're reading as well. And really is important as you start strategizing how you're going to write your grants. And my grant writing has gotten exponentially better, I think, since I've really taken advantage of some of those opportunities. As you're writing those grants, though, don't do what I did the first time around. How much work it takes to submit a grant, right? You work and work and work. And then you're so happy when it's done that you basically, hit the beach and take a sort of a mental vacation from the research that you're doing. But you can't do that because the clock is ticking. You got to think, how can I keep my project forward? How can I maybe take some of that preliminary data to get it published where there are holes? Because you're going to wait 4 months till you get your review back, and you don't want to have wasted that time. And I always assume it won't get funded and I'm going to have to resubmit it or do something else. And so I want to be ready with kind of the next iteration and really try to be focused in the work that I'm doing in that intervening time. And invariably, as I mentioned, a lot of grants come back poorly scored, right? Maybe not funded. So I go through the stages, the 5 stages, which is, did they even read the grant? They didn't understand it, to just rage at the whole thing. My career change is always Starbucks. I will work at a Starbucks at some point. And then you sort of bargain, you focus on your regrets. But at the end of the day, you see some of the reviewers' points, maybe not all of them. And you reread your grant a few more times. You say, okay, I can fix this. And hopefully you've been, continuing to keep your progress and sort of momentum going in that intervening time, and you get back at it again. But this is the reality of being a surgeon scientist, right? It's working your butt off, having it maybe not go the way you want it to, and having the resilience to get back in there and do it again. And I think, part of the journey of being, an acute care surgeon scientist is the ability to expand your network. So in general, whether it's in my own institution with my colleagues or in societies, I'm always trying to be around people that are smarter than me, right? So if I look around and I feel I have, significant inferiority complex, and I think I don't know as much as everybody else, I'm generally in the right room, because these are the kind of folks that can, provide you new ideas, be sounding boards, and help you raise your game. And I've found that as well through Center, and I've been lucky to work with Dr. Kozar in Center and some other really, really smart people, and work on some science with them. And again, this is all about continuing to learn, get better, develop new skills. And then you also get to make friends and have a lot of colleagues, and have people that you can work on projects with and hang out with. So my parting comments for you, sort of the tips for success. The first is resiliency. It is not easy. Said another way, it's really hard. And you have to be ready for that, and you have to be ready to deal with the good times deal with the bad times and enjoy the good times, and enjoy the journey along the way. The next is be opportunistic. So take opportunities to collaborate, take opportunities to get outside your lab and walk into somebody else's lab or somebody else's lab meeting, and learn something new, and find people that kind of get you out of your comfort zone a little bit. The next is embrace the joy of being wrong. That's a lot of what science is. That's a lot about what I think, having funding or working for funding is the joy of being wrong, but it allows you the opportunity to get better. And then the last, I think, is super important, which is find your challenge network. You need to find those people that are not just going to look at your grant and provide you some grammatical changes. You need people to tell you it's not good enough. You need people to say, hey, you got to take this in a different direction. You need people who are going to give you the hard truths, and can really, again, raise the bar for you and make you better. So enjoy the journey, build a great team, work with people you might not work with otherwise, travel, go to some good meetings. There definitely is not a magic formula. If there is, I don't have it. Maybe Dr. Kozar will tell us what it is, and otherwise keep at it. So thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here, and look forward to taking some questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Constantini. Great advice and insight. And again, to the attendees, please keep track of your questions and write them down. We'll have an opportunity at the end to ask the experts. And last and definitely not least, we'll transition to Dr. Rosemary Kozar and explore reflections and future directions.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and it's funny listening to the other people talk, because you sort of have a lot of similar thoughts and similar experiences. I probably didn't read the memo correctly, so I formatted mine a little bit differently, but I think what I'll do is interject some thoughts in the meantime. So just to tell you a little bit about sort of my trajectory, because I think I did things a little bit differently. I got a PhD in the middle of my surgical residency after having done like a month of research as a medical student and not understanding a word about what a PhD was. I took a first job in a place that offered me a big lab, but it was in the basement of a building by myself. And it wasn't really until I got a job in Houston and found, a mentor and sort of understood then what research was. And I've only recently figured out about collaborators. I just didn't get it, or like what I could contribute. And so maybe as I talk, I'll try to put little words about some of those experiences. If I can get my slide to work, that would help. Here we go. So one of the things Alex asked me to talk a little bit about is setting a timeline for milestones and goals. So I think the first thing, if you say, okay, I want to write a grant, or, I want to be an expert in whatever the subject is you got to sort of figure out, I think, where you're going to submit your grant to. It's a very, very, very different grant if you're submitting to PCORI versus the NIH versus a foundation, for instance. So you sort of have to understand your funder and then set a date. Like, look, if you look at whatever the agency is, you'll find a date, and you might not be able to submit in 2 months, but pick the next date and say, I'm going to do it. And then you have to become an expert. You can't write a grant on something you don't know anything about. I've done it a couple of times, but I've spent a lot of time sort of understanding the field. I personally think a good way to do that, if it's a new area for you, is to write a review article. First, it makes you have every reference. Second, you have a publication in the field. And then third, you really do become an expert because you read everything. And don't assume you're an expert. I've been amazed by grants I've submitted in areas I think I know a lot about, and some reviewer will, come up with something or mention some references or something I missed. And I'm like, how did I not know that? You don't really want that to happen to you. And then start writing. So even if you don't have like preliminary data or, an exact research plan, do something. The significance is really, the background is really your review article. You could write that without pretty much anything. You just need to know kind of the basic idea of what you're doing. If you're writing a K grant, probably 75% of your grant is not science. It's your career development plan and who you are and all that kind of stuff. Do your bio sketch. There's a bunch of stuff that isn't science that is really important for your grant as well. So then I said, well, what would I do if I had to do it over again? Well, I mentioned I got a PhD. It's not that I think that's a bad idea. It just wasn't, I didn't do my homework. I didn't understand what I was doing, and I did not have a good experience. I was sort of shown the hallway and say, kind of go for it. So it wasn't a good experience. But I think regardless if it's a PhD or just an active lab or, area, it doesn't have to be a basic science lab. You want to really do your homework, and you want to be in a place and with a person that has your interests at heart, understands your field. You don't have to work with the surgeon, but you still want to be able to submit your data to surgical meetings because you need your colleagues to know who you are. And then you need to be productive. So you want to be in a lab that puts out stuff, not one paper every 2 years. So you have to think about all those. So it wasn't so much the PhD, it was just my experience with it. The other thing I didn't learn, probably to pretty recent, is learn what your institution has to offer you. I've been amazed as I, sort of work with some younger people writing like K grants and so forth at different institutions, what they have. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I think if you look what places could offer you, there'll be people, that's their job, is to help you get funded. So learn wherever you're at what they have to offer. And then I would find a collaborator earlier. And like I said, I didn't really know what they were or what I could offer. Like, I'm writing my grant, I have to know what I'm doing. Like, what am I supposed to, what do I ask a collaborator to do? And that sort of fell into my lap a number of years ago. I ran into someone I had met many years earlier. He was given a talk, and he's a hematologist, actually a trained neurosurgeon, who does basic science in TBI. And he and I started talking, and we realized we were kind of looking at the same thing, endothelial dysfunction and coagulopathy, but I was looking at it in hemorrhage and he was looking at it in TBI, and we had a lot of common overlap. And I learned very quickly that it's really nice to work with someone super smart. And we took some of his science and kind of applied it to the patient population that I understood. We wrote a grant together, and I, honest to God, didn't understand much of anything. When we first submitted the grant, it didn't get funded the first time, which was a new experience for him and a very common one for me. But by the second time, I actually kind of understood the science, and it's been just a wonderful working relationship for me. He's a really good basic scientist. It is much more fun to write a grant with somebody. You divide, you conquer, you have somebody to talk to, somebody to run things across. It's really so much nicer. And then lastly, Todd mentioned this, I find the hardest challenge for me, and if I had to do it over again, I'd spend more time, is keeping up with the technology. I find that really challenging. So it's hard. But you have to know enough to know what you should be proposing or what's there available. I find that difficult as a surgeon who spends time in the lab and writes grants and also, has clinical responsibilities. There's only so much time in the day, but I would figure out how to do that better. And then what are some barriers for you guys? Competition is tough, and I don't know what's going on recently, but it seems like it's worse. And I think we as surgeons are not prepared. We don't have the background. We don't have the technology. Sometimes we don't maybe have the training. In the way that I think that we do our residency, and you do your research time 3, 4, 5, 6 years before you finish, does us a big injustice, because if you look at the medical fields, a lot of them do the research time like at the end of their fellowship, so they can transition from a trainee to a faculty, having preliminary data and ideas and even writing grants. We just don't do it that well. I think it is hard to balance your surgical skills with research. You want protected time, but particularly when you're starting out, you need to figure out how to be a surgeon. And I think that's a hard balance. The KO8s, I don't think do a justice to us with mandating 75% time. It used to be 50% for surgeons, and they changed that. I don't know why they changed it, but I don't think that's good for us. And then the other thing is to really find some experts in the field and mentors that aren't just, Todd mentioned this, you don't want someone just to do a cursory read. You really need someone that's committed and has the time and will help you write it and make it better. Not to say, oh, good job, put a comma here. It takes a long time to really read and read it critically. And that's hard because we're all like really, really busy. So what about the shrinking surgeon scientist? Well, I think we should sort of figure out what is a surgeon scientist in 2024. Like it used to be someone like, say, Todd and I are doing basic science and are surgeons, but I don't know, what's the person doing bioinformatics, big data, comparative effectiveness, virtual reality, and being a surgeon? Like, what are those? Are they still surgeon scientists? I think so. Yeah, they're just doing it different. So maybe we need to think about it in a little different context. And I bet you there's more people than we think. I think we need to make it fun and appealing and valued. I love what I do. Like Todd mentioned this too. I have a very short attention span, I've realized, and I get bored really easily. And so I really like dabbling and do my basic science. I do clinical research. I do clinical practice. I dabble probably more than I should dabble. But you want people, your trainees, to see you having fun. Because if all you're doing is being miserable and complaining, who's going to want to do that? Who's going to want to hear, oh my God, I didn't get funded. Nobody gets funded. It's really terrible. No one's going to want to do that. It's not like that. They're successful people and it is fun. I think we probably need to spend a little balancing the skills with the research time. We need to think about that a little bit and really figure out how to do a good job on a personal basis. And I think as a career, as surgeons. And then we need to find and cultivate mentors that are really willing to help you. Without saying too much about this, because it's in the very, very, very preliminary stages, the AAST, we're working to sort of figure this out and to develop a very structured mentor-mentee relationship and commitment on both sides, because I think that's what it really, really takes to be successful. So what are some final tips? you know, I spend a lot of time on review panels because I learn, and I think it's important for me, in my last point, to give back. And as I read these, particularly like the K grants and T32 applications and so forth, the applicants almost all have some kind of training. I don't think you have to. You either need to be productive early on, you need to maybe get the society grants, you need to show that you have a track record. Master's in clinical sciences, being a productive T32 residence. I think all of those, you need to learn stuff. There's so much stuff now that needs to be understood, whether it's statistics or study design, bioinformatic, whatever it is, you probably need to spend some time learning more than just, you know, what you could pick up on the internet. It is hard. It is really hard. But it is possible. And I think we need to teach people that it's possible. You should ask for help, but it's not don't expect that you're going to necessarily get what you think. You know, even if you have a mentor, that person has a job too, right? And they're probably doing the same thing you're trying to do. So, you know, it's hard, and you have to respect other people's time. And if you want them to read your grant, you know, be considerate. Don't, two things, don't give it to them 2 days before it's due. And for heaven's sakes, if there's somebody successful and tell you a bunch of tips, things to change, do it. Don't ignore them. I mean, if you're really asking people that you respect their opinion, then be willing to accept the criticism and the changes that you probably need to make. Persevere. I have many more X's than Todd showed on his timeline. A lot. I my very first grant, I think it was my KO8 I wrote. And the first time I wrote it, it didn't get funded. And I literally called the program officer and I sobbed hysterically. Luckily, he was an incredibly nice person and went on to become a good friend of mine. But you know, as you get a lot of rejection, it doesn't quite hurt as bad. And I think part of it is, you know, when you write that first grant, you put your heart and your soul and like every waking minute into it. And as you go along, it's a little easier writing a grant than it used to be. And so maybe it's not so hard to get rejected, or maybe you just get a little used to it. But hang in there. You know, if you don't keep trying, you don't get funded. You know, I can't tell you how many rejections I've gotten, but all you need is a few yeses. And then as I mentioned again, give back. Even at a junior level, read somebody's grant. It's really important that a non-expert can understand your grant. So if you have a junior partner doing nothing related to what you're doing, ask them to read it, because you're going to have reviewers that know nothing or very little about what you're writing on, and you have to educate them in a short period of time how to understand your topic. So I think it's really good to have someone with no expertise in your field to read that. And even if someone can just say, the formatting's bad, the grammar's bad, I don't understand the signet. I mean, there's little things that people at any level can be really important. So ask people and be willing to do that for others. And I think I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions with everybody else.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great. And I disagree with you. I think you did the thing correctly. You got the brief. You all did. I want to give a plug. We have a very brave first questionnaire in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And this is from Carlos Menegozzo. And it's a question that was originally directed to Dr. Constantini, but I actually want to open it up to all three panelists, if I may. And the question is, what advice would you give someone who's looking to expand his or her network or connections internationally? And so maybe we can talk about generically, domestically, and internationally. And maybe we can start with you, Dr. Constantini, because that was the question addressed to you, but I'd love to hear Dr. Siletz and Dr. Kozar, your thoughts as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you have to get out, you have to put yourself out there. I'm not an extrovert, but you have to reach out to folks and try to make those connections, because you may meet somebody at a meeting. It's even harder when you think about internationally. But you have to try to connect with people, and I actually have some international collaborations with researchers who saw a paper that was in a similar area and reached out by email and led to collaboration and things like that. And I would recommend doing things like that. Just reach out to people. The worst they can do is say no, but you have to be proactive.
Can I open that up to you, Drs. Siletz and Kozar? International collaboration or domestic collaboration, what's been most useful for you both in terms of networking, mentorship? Everyone on the panel mentioned having your team, building your mentor network, making alliances. I think you all were very open, which we appreciate, but I'm going to put it back on you all to be really specific, and we can name other organizations that are not behind our heads on this this talk, because I think this really should be for the benefit of our listeners. How do we go about doing this as young surgeon scientists?
I'll give a couple words on the international part, and I don't know a great deal about it. I also have had people, reach out to me and about a paper or a technique, and I've reached out to people, I have no idea who they are, and they've been phenomenal. And so one thing, if you get an email from someone, read it and try to help them, and vice versa. And then if you want to do a collaboration, I probably think the best way, if they're a surgeon, is to go to a meeting where they're going to be, and a personal connection, I think, is always best. I'll quickly mention mentors. I had one very well-known surgeon you guys would all know that was on study section and read one of my grants, and I think he felt bad for me, and he pulled himself off, declared a conflict and said, "Let me help you." I didn't know the person, I mean, very casually, but it was just someone, it was another surgeon who wanted to help. And those are not a common one, but it was certainly, incredibly appreciated. And some you just fall into their lap, and some just don't work out. When I started, this wasn't like the mentorship wasn't a formal process. It wasn't the focus, but I was just incredibly fortunate to work. I worked with Fred Moore, and he just said, "This is what I do. This is what the lab do. Work on this thing." And then this very famous physiologist heard what we were working on and had some kind of thoughts on a related topic, and he literally knocked on my door one day. So I got to say, I've been lucky. I don't know the best way to reach out, but there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do this. It's just, the success of trying to match people, I personally think, is very difficult. Doesn't mean it can't work, but a personal connection, I think is a little bit easier.
Dr. Siletz, how about you?
I don't know how much
what's
I'm going to be able to add to these excellent comments. I guess the only thing that I can think of, and not specific to international, but I guess once you do have the opportunity to meet somebody and to collaborate with them, particularly if it's someone that you don't necessarily know very well, I think that particularly if you're in the more junior setting, it can be very fruitful to the relationship if, you talk about, oh, we're going to do this thing together. And the next time you talk to them, you're like, look at all this progress that I made on that thing. And, really tidy it up for them and make it, it I think sends a good impression. And also, these are people who are very good at getting things done and probably are excited all the time about getting things done. So when they see something that's getting done, I think we all get excited. So that is a good way to sort of start your friendship on a good note.
Thank you so Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Looks like there's another question from our audience from Evelyn Coyle. I hope I said that correctly. So the question, and this is not to any particular person, so I'd love to hear from each of our three panelists. That there was, so we mentioned about gaining. So there was a mention of gaining an opportunity of NIH grant review as a means to enhancing grant writing. I think that was part of Dr. Constantini's presentation. And so we would all like to hear your about elaborating more on this opportunity and how to obtain this. And then if the other speakers can also talk about this, if what's helped them.
Yeah, I'll just give my experience. I think it is hard to break into reviewing NIH grants because that opportunity doesn't always, just come along. But there are some societies, I think it was the AAS or SUS had a program where they would sort of, ask for people who might be interested, and they advocated to sort of get you onto a study section, which got me onto a study section. It also doesn't have to be NIH grants. I've reviewed a lot of society grants for multiple different societies, so junior investigator and even resident grants. And these are still really good opportunities to look at different ways to format things, different ways to pose your aims, and sort of formatting and sort of approach things that I think are very useful. So there's lots of opportunities. You just got to seek them out.
How about more generically about the grant writing
Yeah.
process? If Dr. Siletz or Dr. Kozar want to speak to that, maybe Dr. Siletz, I don't know if you've written a formal sort of national grant yet, but in terms of applying for the AAST award or other projects that you've been working on, what's been the most helpful for you in terms of supporting that process?
Honestly, the most helpful thing for me in supporting that process was having a mentor who had done it very successfully many, many times before and knew all these tips and tricks, some of which I will just spew out right now. Why not? One of them being, to be very familiar with the format of the grant, like when you're getting started. Obviously, it is obvious, but it's important to hear it for the first time. And then who would read my grant and fix the grantsmanship. I think, that perfect fine line between overstating your results, but like being really excited about your research. That's something that it really is an art. And having someone who's a really excellent artist teach you how to do that, I think is really wonderful. And then there's all these little insider tips and tricks that probably the other panelists can speak more to, having experienced it more on the other side than I have, but contacting the program officers, as we heard from Dr. Kozar, from her early days, that was something that I didn't know to do. And just to maintain a conversation with them as your work sort of evolves is apparently a very fruitful thing to do. And I've had good success with that N of 1. But I'm assured by my dear mentor, Dr. Perrin Cobb, that it's just that can be a lifelong relationship that can be incredibly helpful to you, not just to get funding, but to improve your science. And I don't know if others have more to say about that.
Yeah, I'll amplify the part about getting, speaking to your program officer and having a communication and a relationship. All the people that I know that are very well funded have a very good relationship, and with their program officer. It's part of what you need to do. They can help tell you, lead you in the right direction, and what the study section might be, looking for, and how to approach things. It's a critical thing.
Just to add on to that quickly, there, depending on, like, for the NIH, which institute you go to, some of them have a strict funding cutoff and others don't. And the program officers have a very large impact on who gets funded and who doesn't. So having someone invested in you who knows you, it is not at all a bad thing. Others, it doesn't really make a difference. The other thing I've learned is, I was writing a grant with one of my collaborators, and it was an area that we sort of hadn't done before, and it didn't seem to fit anywhere. And it took us a while, but finally, one program officer gave us a suggestion for another one. So it was someone we didn't really know in a division we didn't know a lot about. And just having that conversation with this person and him saying, this is our focus, this is how we look at things. He just kind of gave us tips of, buzzwords to use and just little things to do I would never, ever have thought of had we not had that conversation with them. And also just, they may say, sorry, this just doesn't fit within my portfolio, so don't waste your time. And some of them, I said the guy, and he was very nice. He's like, look, I'm so sorry, Rosemary. I don't like to say no to anybody, but this just doesn't fit. So it's really useful for that. Now, like the Department of Defense, there's not that kind of person that you could talk to. And like a society grant, there probably is. And so again, it's knowing your funding source and figuring out if that's a relationship you can build.
The other just very basic grant writing tip that took me a while to figure out is don't procrastinate. You need to not leave it to the last minute. And the why is because you get so into it when you're writing it all at one time. You know, if you put it down for a week, I put things down for a week and gone back and read it, that I was sure it was the greatest grant ever written. And I was like, this is complete garbage. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, you have to step away from it and look at it again and, have, numerous drafts as you kind of go through that process. So don't procrastinate like me.
Thank you, guys. So our next question is from Jonathan Mezoso. And the question is, so we talked about the KO8 grants. So with the 75% requirement for surgeons, that was recently done. The question is it something that's really worth it? Is one putting oneself at a disadvantage for future funding if you haven't received a career mentoring award? And then the other part of the question was there's very strong opinions for and against applying for a K, particularly since it requires a large amount of protected time. And so would love to hear thoughts from our panelists today.
I'm going to let one of you guys, I'm going to step away for a second. It sounds like the alarm clock in my hotel room is going off. I'll be right back.
I think it's a tough one. I didn't have a K award. I actually didn't apply for one. I've mentored people applying for them. I know people who have them. It's challenging. The time commitment's challenging, and the budget that you are given to do your research, I mean, is challenging. So you have to have a lot of institutional support to be able to pull it off. And if you have that, it's great. But it's hard to support a lab on an R01 or an R35 budget to get things done, much less KOA. But again, you got to look at your institution and the resources and the things that you can use.
I think there's definitely pros and there's definitely cons. I found one of the more important things is if whatever grant you get, whether it's the NIH is interested in you. Once you're funded, they want you to continue to be funded and they're vested in you. So from that standpoint, I don't think they really care what it is. Whether you get an F grant when you're a trainee, we can't really get the 99 to 00s, but a KO8, an R01, an R21, it's just kind of getting in that pipeline. There are definitely pros and cons to the KO8. I won't say anything more than that. It's a nice starting block, but it costs your department a lot of money.
I'd like to dovetail on that. Dr. Kozar, you mentioned something, if I'm switching hats and putting on my APD for surgery residency hat, there was a recent JAMA surgery piece sort of speaking to some of the things that you spoke about this idea of putting our trainees, whether they're residents or fellows, at a relative disadvantage based on how historically we've structured either, if you want to call it research time, academic time, professional development time. I'm going to give you all the power in the world. You are now the boss of ACGME, the Residency Review Committee. You can be the president for all I care. How would you change our paradigm of surgical training to better support surgical scientists, whether that's at the medical student level, at the resident level, or at the fellow level? I can open that up to everybody, but you had specifically sort of brought up these ideas about doing things differently, reevaluating life choices, but also sort of talking about looking to the future, both giving back and looking forward.
There's a couple of different ways you could do it. There's been some things put out, like, should it be a process throughout your surgical residency where you have a month or two every every year? And there are a couple of pathways now to do that more. I don't know. I'm not sure we know enough if that one's going to work. I think it would work more for a clinical grant and not a basic science one, because it's a little harder to get things started and stopping. But but like we as surgeons cannot get the K9900 grant because of the way that we do things. And that's a really great way to get a first job. If you go in and say, I've got an NIH grant, you give me a job and I'm going to have an R01 essentially for the next 2 or 3 years, that's pretty powerful. And we don't have that ability to do it. So whether we figure out how to give someone, and you could be a T32 after you finish training, there's no rules to that. I just think it's harder. First, no one really talks about it. And then, it's hard to make $60,000, $70,000 versus a surgeon's salary. It's given up a lot to do that. I think it's a little easier in the middle of your residency when you don't really understand it. So there's lots to think about, but I really think doing it later and getting the data and be prepared to write a grant when you start a job is powerful. And it's something that we don't really have the ability to do.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know, Dr. Constantini or Dr. Siletz, do you have any thoughts about either how you might do your training different or what changes you'd proposed? I gave Dr. Kozar all of the power, but I can take some of the power back and give it to you to make these choices.
No, leave her with the power.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think there's no good time. I do worry a little, as it seems, the research for some places has gone a little earlier, even after the second year. I think it just gets more challenging the earlier you do it. And if you're really planning on it in your career, I think you have to keep your hand in it a little bit after you're done with your research fellowship. You can't just step away. I don't think for a few years and come back and just jump right into it.
Okay, I guess
Awesome.
I have one more comment that actually I would love if the other panelists could comment on my comment. I hear how challenging it is, and I agree that it's been very challenging. So I went through the MSCP program, which is combined MD PhD in med school, and it's like a very structured thing. We went to like MD PhD grand rounds, where we would talk about an interesting clinical case and then like an amazing discovery that happened, in science that supported the treatment for whatever it was. And very few of the people who were involved in the MSCP program were surgeons. None were trauma surgeons. But a very, very high percentage of the people who we presented their work as, and then they discovered this cure, a really high percentage of those people were surgeons. And I definitely did notice that when I was told over and over again that you can't have both of those things at the same time. And so I propose this thought to you. I think that, everybody has their own individual strengths. And I think that there are specific scientific strengths to being a surgeon. Which are different than the strengths that you would have if you were a basic scientist who was, had time to read every single thing as soon as it comes off the press and know every single technique. And those people, we need to have strong relationships, strong collaborative relationships with them for sure. But I think surgical training in itself really does help you, first of all, to know the body, medical science in a way that, for me as a translational person, I think is really valuable. But then also the ability to have a mountain of data, whatever that is, whether it's clinical data on call or whatever, and pick out the one thing that really matters. I think that's actually that your brain sort of throughout those 5 clinical years and then your fellowship actually gets trained in a way that can be extremely valuable as a scientist. So I don't know, I'm like at the beginning of this and I've had, a little baby success so far, but it really is baby stuff. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
You can go first, Todd. The hard one.
It is a hard one. We do have a unique skill set. I think that's what makes collaborations fruitful, right? There's scientists that need to and want to collaborate with us because we have a perspective that they don't have. And so I think we are uniquely suited to not be cliche, but think about sort of bench to bedside issues that other people don't. But to your point, we don't have, the time difference, the amount of time to focus on the specifics. And I think that's why these collaborations are so important, because you're going to each bring something very different to the table that is going to help. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think, I do think there's a good synergy there between basic scientists and then surgeon scientists as well.
No, it's an interesting thought process because I think we all do stuff in the lab that is meaningful to us clinically. Like I would have trouble, looking at, I don't know, cell X, that does whatever. But if I could translate it, to my patient, it's got meaningful clinical outcomes to me, the patient. That to me is much more exciting. So I think you're right. We've got that ability to understand what's important clinically and go backwards, where I think some other people don't have that ability.
Thank you. I appreciate your
Awesome.
comment.
Well, thank you to our amazing expert speakers for their valuable insight and advice, and for a fantastic webinar, and to all the participants for joining this session. We do want to mention that the 5th annual AASD East SCC PDS virtual job fair will be taking place on November 7th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Central Time. And we hope you can join us to explore amazing career opportunities. Again, thank you to all the speakers and all the participants.